come and join us. I think you have something going on up here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A, and then Dr. Moreland will speak after me. There'll be a little Q&A after his presentation, and then Dr. Grudem. And then there'll be a joint Q&A to finish. I'm really happy that we do have the questions and answers. It reminds me of something that happened to me when I was studying in Britain. My first year in Cambridge, I was a little intimidated by the whole surroundings, and there was a lecturer who came, who was a distinguished professor with expertise about the philosopher Immanuel Kant. I'd had one course on Kant as an undergraduate, and soon was in way over my head as I listened to this lecture, and I apparently asked a question that revealed some ignorance on my part, and I asked the professor if he could give me a reference, a source where I could read more about an aspect of Kant's work, which I admitted not knowing anything about. And when I acknowledged that, there was an awkward, uncomfortable silence in the room, a little shuffling of feet. The professor obliged me. He gave me a source. Then afterwards, my supervisor took me aside and he said, Meyer, he said, I know in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. It's different here. He then gave me some sage counsel and said that in future, he said, if you have a question that reveals ignorance, come ask me privately. And then he said, everyone here is bluffing. And if you're to succeed, you must learn to bluff too. So anyway, we will have Q&A, a couple sessions, and it will be American rules. No stupid questions, okay? A little over a year ago, I had a chance to go back to Britain to attend an event, a scientific conference that was put on by the Royal Society of London. And I'm hoping this will work. That says Q&A. That's not good. Uh-oh. And yeah, so we're having a little problem with the slides here. Am I maybe to skip through these introductory slides to get, there we go. Excellent. Okay, Royal Society of London. The Royal Society is arguably the world's most august scientific body. It goes back to Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and the Royal Society in November of 2016 called a conference to discuss the status of current evolutionary theory. The conference was called by leading evolutionary, mainly evolutionary biologists who were, as it happens, very unhappy with the current status of evolutionary theory. In particular, the textbook theory of evolution known as Neo-Darwinism or modern Darwinism, contemporary Darwinian theory. The conference started with a professor who gave an opening talk on the explanatory deficits of the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis is another name for Neo-Darwinism. And he outlined a number of problems with the theory, almost all of which had to do with the lack of creative power surrounding the famed natural selection random mutation mechanism. Some of these are scientific terms that may kind of flow over you, but this was his list. Neo-Darwinism doesn't explain the origin of phenotypic complexity. A phenotype is the visible body form of an animal. It doesn't explain the origin of anatomical novelty. It does a nice job of explaining the small-scale variations, why the Galapagos finches, for example, might have a variation in the shape and size of their beak in response to varying weather patterns. But it doesn't explain very well, as many of the scientists there would acknowledge, the large-scale innovations that produced birds in the first place. There's a small-scale variation, but not large-scale innovation of anatomical novelty. Doesn't explain well the origin, the abrupt appearance of major groups of animals in the fossil record. What he called the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, abrupt appearance of fossils. It also doesn't explain that there are non-genetic factors involved in inheritance. DNA turns out not to be the whole show. And it also has problems with a number of other things that he enumerated. Most of these things have to do with the lack of creative power, of genuine innovative power of the mutation selection mechanism. In a previous book, Professor Muller wrote, he and his co-author said that Neo-Darwinism has no theory of the generative. When I first came across this was an MIT press book written published in 2003. They also had a table of all the unsolved problems of Neo-Darwinism, one of which was the origin of biological form. And I thought, wait a minute, I thought that's what Darwin resolved back in 1859. And as you get deeper and deeper into the mainstream literature in the field of evolutionary biology, notice I didn't say books about intelligent design or something like, I'm talking about the mainstream field of evolutionary biology. The kinds of problems that Professor Muller and his co-author have highlighted are being acknowledged by more and more leading people in the field. And so the conference at the Royal Society in November of 2016 was called to address these problems. And it highlights, I think, a kind of extraordinary anomaly or irony. And that is that at just the time that we have mainstream evolutionary biologists acknowledging that the supposed driving mechanism of evolutionary progress or innovation lacks creative power, we have more and more people in the religious world, in the Christian world, especially intellectual thought leaders in the Christian world, telling the rest of the folks in the Christian world that they need to accept Darwinian evolution lest they bring intellectual disrepute upon the church, lest they be out of sync with cutting-edge intellectual and scientific developments. Here's an example of one of the folks who is advocating what's known as theistic evolution, the idea that somehow we must merge a theistic worldview or a biblical worldview or a Christian worldview or a Judeo-Christian worldview with the evolutionary worldview or the evolutionary, contemporary versions of evolutionary theory. This is Deborah Harzma, a very nice person, a very sincere Christian, but this is her view. She says evolutionary creationists accept that natural selection and other evolutionary mechanisms acting over long periods of time eventually result in major changes in body structures. Some people call this macroevolution. Macroevolution. She then goes on to say that thus evolution is a natural mechanism by which God providentially achieves his creative processes, or purposes rather, or as she also puts it, it's the gradual process of evolution was crafted and governed by God to create the diversity of life on Earth. And this is the irony I want to highlight. At just the time when leading evolutionary biologists are explicitly acknowledging that the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutation and selection lacks creative power, we have an increasing number of Christians working in the sciences and Christian science and faith organizations like the Biologos Institute and the Faraday Institute in the United Kingdom, urging folks in the church to accept evolutionary mechanisms as the means by which God creates. Those very same mechanisms that leading evolutionary biologists are saying, hey, it accounts for the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. That's one rather common quote now. Mutation and selection account for the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. The small-scale variation, yes. The large-scale innovation, no. No genuine creativity, in other words, associated with the mechanism. Now, it's understandable why many Christians, even Christians working in the sciences, would have come to this point of view. We hear over and over again from science popularizers, from spokespersons for official science education organizations or official organizations such as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that there is an overwhelming consensus in favor of contemporary Darwinian theory. I had a chance in 2009 to testify before the Texas State Board of Education. They were addressing a new science education standard that was being debated at the Texas State Board. And it was a standard that was encouraging teachers to inform students about the strengths and weaknesses of scientific theories and competing ideas about contentious theories. One of the advocates of a Darwin-only approach to science education, Eugenie Scott, pictured here on the screen, came and was interviewed in the Dallas Morning News before she testified to this same hearing and said, you can't apply this strengths and weaknesses idea to the teaching of Darwinian theory because there are no weaknesses in the theory of evolution. Now, I found that rather breathtaking. I was there with a stack of 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles from mainstream biology journals that were acknowledging weaknesses in the standard versions of evolutionary theory. So I knew there were plenty of counterexamples to what Dr. Scott was claiming. But these types of statements are made all the time, and it's given the impression in our broader culture of a consensus that does not exist within evolutionary biology itself. Here's another example of one of these very dogmatic statements. I particularly like this one. It's from Richard Dawkins. He says, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane, and then he adds parenthetically, or wicked, but I'd prefer not to think about that. I thought that was rather sporting of him not to consider that people who disagree with him are wicked. In any case, this was in the New York Times, and these major cultural purveyors of opinion have been almost unanimous in their claim that contemporary evolutionary theory is without flaws and is accepted by an overwhelming majority of all reasonable and informed people, especially scientifically informed people. Now, that I think is covering up what's really going on in evolutionary biology. In my book, Darwin's Doubt, I described in the preface to the book what I framed as a huge disparity. In fact, I argued that there's never been such a great disparity between the statements in favor of the theory by leading popularizers on the one hand, and the actual status of the theory as you learn about it in peer-reviewed, relevant technical articles. So let's get into this a little more. This is a book that was published about a group of evolutionary biologists called the Altenberg 16. These are evolutionary biologists who are basically saying, hey, we need a new theory. Neo-Darwinism is dead. The mutation selection mechanism does not purchase any genuine novelty. It's not creative. We need some new mechanisms to supplement, complement, extend, or replace the Neo-Darwinian theory that we all learn about in our high school and biology college textbooks. The subtitle kind of tells it all. The author is saying, look, the Darwin industry is way beyond what the facts will support. Now, this is obviously a theological context. We're in a church, and we're in a seminary where there are theological scholars and biblical scholars. And we, J.P. Moreland and Dr. Grudeman and I and two other editors, two scientific editors, put together this book in a way because we want to speak directly to the same group of people that the theistic evolutionists are speaking to. The Bible scholars and theologians and church leaders who have been told, and I would say in some cases bullied into thinking that they have to read the Bible, the biblical text, through an evolutionary lens. They have to read the Bible as if it were known by all reasonable people that contemporary evolutionary theory is true and indisputable. And we want to dispute that, and I, speaking as a Christian layman, but also a proponent of the theory of intelligent design, want to relieve theologians of the sense of intellectual obligation that they must genuflect before this alleged consensus in favor of a theory which in fact is crumbling. Now, I'm not denying that there are attempts to supplement the evolutionary mechanism with new mechanisms, and the evolutionary biologists they're not all rushing to embrace the theory of intelligent design that I hold. But they are certainly raising very formidable questions about the standard theory that has been presented as the consensus view. And the new views that are being presented, as I'll show as I get more into the talk, are themselves not solving the problems that have been raised. There is not a consensus around any evolutionary mechanism that has genuine creative power. So anyway, what I'd like to do today now is, in a sense, liberate at least the theologically inclined folks in the audience from thinking that they need to reformulate their theological understanding in light of evolutionary theory. And I want to show you why the equation of God's creative power with the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is not credible. It makes very little sense to say God used mechanism X to create when mechanism X demonstrably lacks creative power. So let's get into that. First of all, let's talk a little bit about what theistic evolution is, and then I want to critique the evolution part of theistic evolution. But it's very important to understand the term evolution first. It can have multiple meanings. So in the book, we were very careful to point out that depending on which meaning of the term evolution you embrace, the term theistic evolution or the concept of evolution, theistic evolution, can either be problematic or not. For example, there's a very innocuous meaning of evolution, which just means change over time. Nearly no one disputes this. Some people, and that's because there's such good observational evidence for this idea of change over time. For one thing, life today is very different than the life that's documented in the fossil record. And so we can see that change has occurred. That's a meaning that almost no one disputes. Secondly, we see the small-scale variations of the kind I described earlier with the Galapagos finches, or the famed peppered moth example, or the acquisition of antibiotic resistance in bacterial organisms. This type of small-scale variation is well documented and well observed, and virtually no one disputes it. So if you want to say, I believe in God and I believe in that kind of evolution, you have no quarrel with any of the speakers tonight or any of the authors and contributors to our book. A second meaning of evolution is slightly more contentious. This is the idea that not only has there been change over time, but the change has been continuous over a long period of time, such that the history of life can be best depicted or represented as a great branching tree in which the branches at the top of the tree represent all the forms of life we see today, the giraffes and the heffalumps and the fish and the birds and whatever. There are no heffalumps, though. I think that's Winnie the Pooh. In any case, but all those forms of life today have evolved or changed or transformed. They've morphed and changed from one simple or very few simple organisms way back a long time ago. This is the great Darwinian tree of life, the idea that everything is connected by common ancestry. And this theory or notion of evolution, we might call this evolution number 2, is what's known as the theory of universal common descent or universal common ancestry. For those of us who are proponents of intelligent design, that's not the thing that we mainly are challenging, but in our book we do raise scientific challenges to the theory of universal common descent in the new book on theistic evolution, and you can have a look at that. The most important and contentious idea of evolution, though, is the third meaning. This is the cause of the change that is depicted in the tree of life, or the alleged cause. And that is the idea of natural selection acting on random variations, or a particular type of variation known as a mutation, a random change in the sequence of characters in the genetic molecule DNA. Now, and according to modern forms of Darwinian theory, modern Neo-Darwinism, this mechanism of mutation acting on, or natural selection acting on random mutation, is capable of producing all the new forms of life that have arisen since the beginning of life on Earth, all those forms of life depicted by the tree of life. And that mechanism is also sufficient to account for the appearance of design that biologists almost universally recognize in all forms of life. Richard Dawkins has famously said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Key word? Appearance. That's classical Darwinian thinking and classical modern Darwinian thinking. Things look designed, think coiled nautilus, structure of the eye, the plumbing and electrical system of the heart, the intricate molecular machines inside cells, lots of appearance of design, but that appearance is an illusion because there's an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection acting on random mutations, which can produce the appearance of design without being designed or guided in any way. And that's the thing that is most at issue in the debate. Is there an unguided, undirected process that is truly creative, that can produce all the new forms of life and the appearance of design that they manifest? Increasing number of leading neo-Darwinists are saying, well, our mechanism actually can't get that done. We need some new mechanisms. Now, I think it's important for folks, again, these are the same quotes from Deborah Haarsma about linking the idea of natural selection with God's creativity. What I want now to do is to explain some of the challenges, the scientific challenges to the creative power of natural selection. So in a sense, people will feel relieved of the intellectual obligation to read the biblical text or to alter theological doctrines in light of this alleged consensus. Here's some reasons. Here's some reasons that increasingly scientists are doubting the creative power of the selection mutation mechanism. The first concerns what is in some ways the most fundamental question in all of biology, and that is the origin of genetic and other forms of biological information. I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? Code, thank you. I didn't mean to make you all pretend to be my students, but yeah, you need code, right? You need software, you need instructions. The same thing turns out to be true in life. There are many events in the history of life where you get an abrupt appearance of brand new forms of life emerging in the fossil record. In the new book on theistic evolution, we look at 17 different abrupt appearance events in one particular chapter written with the German paleontologist Günter Beckley. I wrote a book on one of those big events called the Cambrian explosion. But to produce those new forms of life requires new types of cells. And those new types of cells require new molecules called proteins, and those proteins are built from instructions encoded in the DNA molecule. So to build new forms of life, you need new code, you need new instructions, just as is the case in our computer software world. Now, all of this understanding kind of flows from the famed discovery by Watson and Crick in 1953, in which they elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule, and then 4 years later had an amazing aha moment. And this was mainly Crick 4 years later. He formulated something known as the sequence hypothesis, in which he realized that there were particular subunits of the DNA molecule, depicted here, that are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or like the zeros and ones in a section of machine code. The picture here is of the famed DNA molecule with a double helix. On the outside of the helix are molecules, sugar and phosphate subunits. On the inside are subunits, chemical subunits known as nucleotides, or nucleotide bases. And these bases are functioning, Crick argued, like alphabetic characters. They are storing instructions for directing the construction of the crucial proteins that make life possible. And this was an amazing breakthrough moment in the history of biology. In other words, information is running the show inside life. I'm from Seattle, and my office is in Redmond, where also the great Microsoft company is. And in Seattle, we have the Microsoft company. We've got all kinds of great tech companies. We also have the Boeing company. Microsoft makes code. Boeing uses code to construct airplanes. It's a process that's called computer-assisted design and engineering, or CAD/CAM. So you have an engineer sitting at a console, writing some code. The code goes down a wire. It's translated into another machine language that can be read by a manufacturing apparatus. And that code might be taken and used to, say, place rivets on the airplane wing in exactly the right place. So you have digital information directing the construction of a mechanical system. I don't have time to go into all the details of the science of this. There's an animation on my website on darwinsdoubt.com called Journey Inside the Cell that explains how this process works. It's absolutely fascinating. But the long and the short of it is that inside living systems, you have digital information directing the construction of protein machines, machinery made of proteins. It's unbelievably sophisticated information and nanotechnology. And that has raised this crucial question in the history of life, which is, where does the information come from? We know what it does, but we don't know where it comes from. And every time a new form of life arises, we now understand that such a form would have required a big infusion of new information. Where would that information come from? Now, that's the thing that the Neo-Darwinian mechanism, one of the things that the Neo-Darwinian mechanism is having a very hard time explaining. in the information sciences, a distinction is made between essentially a random or merely complex sequence, like the one on the top in the screen you see, and a sequence which is complex in that it's not repetitive like a mantra, but it also performs a communication function or has a meaning. Can you see that there's a qualitative difference between the sequence on the top and the sequence on the bottom? Okay? The kind of information that's present in the DNA molecule is the kind that's present in the sequence on the bottom. It's complex, it's not simply repetitive, but it performs a communication function. It directs the construction of all those protein molecules. Now, so that's the kind of information that needs to be explained every time we get something new arising in life. But according to the Neo-Darwinian story, the Neo-Darwinian mechanism works in the following way, that once you have a functional section of DNA called a gene, then little random changes will accumulate over time, and those random changes will generate completely new genes that can build completely new proteins and protein machines. The problem with that, for anyone who's had any background in, say, computer science, is as you begin to think about that, you realize, well, wait a minute. That means that essentially random changes in an already functional, informationally functional sequence are going to, over time, accumulate and generate something functionally novel and also good, functional. And I many times will just ask computer scientists in the audience, if you've got a section of code and you start introducing random changes to your zeros and ones, are you likely to generate something, a new operating system or program, or are you going to get bugs and glitches? And the programmers usually laugh because they know that long before you get to something fundamentally new, you're going to destroy the function you had already, okay? Now, it turns out there's a reason for that, and it's mathematical, and that is that in any what's called a combinatorial system that might contain information, where you could have different combinations of characters, there are vastly more ways of going wrong than there are of going right. For example, in the English language, for every word of 12 letters, there are about 100 trillion ways of arranging those same letters that will not get you any points on the Scrabble board. The ratio of the functional to the gibberish is very, very, very tiny, okay? Now, as the first big skeptics of the Neo-Darwinian theory started to emerge in the mid to late 60s, and they were mainly mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, and a lot of them came from MIT. They had a conference in 1966 at the Wistar Institute called Mathematical Challenges to Neo-Darwinism. And it was based on this basic intuition that if you have a combinatorial system that contains information, there's a whole lot more ways of arranging characters that are going to give you gibberish than are going to give you function or meaning. And one of the leaders of this conference, Murray Eden, a professor of computer science at MIT in the 60s, said, no currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences in which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. And that intuition, he thought, applied to biology. As the biologists were telling their engineering colleagues more and more about the wonderful information processing system and storage system in DNA and the cell, the engineers who were in those conversations with their colleagues were saying, well, wait a minute, if what you're saying is true about life, that the DNA is literally containing information in a digital form, it's going to be subject to this same problem. Random changes are going to degrade its meaning, its function, long before you get to something new and useful. So they ended up calling a conference about this, explored, there were two sides, the biologists and the math people were arguing back and forth. They couldn't entirely solve the problem, but I want you to understand the problem maybe in terms of something a little bit more familiar, and then I'll bring you up to date on this. This is a bike clock, 4 dials. How many possible ways of arranging the 10 characters on each dial? 4 plus, 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, right? Trick question, right? It's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. So it's 10,000 possible combinations. That's why a bike lock works, right? If every combination allowed you to open the lock, you wouldn't fool any thieves. So you want to hide the combination in the big space of possibilities so the thief doesn't have enough time to find the combination, right? Okay, so imagine I've got a thief outside the church who's found a nice bike that he wants to steal, and he encounters a lock like this. Is it more likely that the thief will succeed or fail in solving the problem of finding the combination at random? Fail, right? Everybody say fail? I've just asked you another trick question. What's tricky about my question? We need to know something else, don't we? Somebody said time. We need to know how many opportunities the thief has to sample the combinations at random. I'm a little bit prone to nerdiness, and one time I actually made this calculation that if the thief has 15 hours sampling the combination, one every 10 seconds, after about 15 hours, the thief will sample more than 5,000 possible combinations, at which point it becomes more likely that he'll succeed than fail, right? So in that case, well, then the answer to my question is it's more likely, success is more likely. So what's my illustration pointing out? It's pointing out that if you want to assess the plausibility of a random search for functional information, you need to know something about the size of the space that needs to be searched, that is the number of possibilities that need to be searched, and you also need to know something about how many opportunities there are to do the searching, all right? Now let's change the thought experiment just a little bit. Let's imagine now this lock. Got the same thief out there, more likely that the thief will succeed or fail. Now it is true. It's more likely, because here's the math. I've done this as well. If the thief lives to be 100 years old, samples one combination every 10 seconds, takes no potty breaks, never stops to eat, has no dates, the thief will sample only about 3% of the total combinations in 100 years. So in that case, it's overwhelmingly more likely that the thief will fail than it is that the thief will succeed. Now you're asking, what on earth does this have to do with biology? Well, remember I was talking about the DNA molecule and how it built proteins? Okay? Proteins are long chain-like molecules that are made of subunits called amino acids. And I've represented them with these snap-lock beads. The box said ages 2 to 4, but I hope you won't be offended. And it happens that there are 20 or so protein-forming amino acids. Different, you could think of a different color bead, 20 different kinds. But to get a protein to fold into a shape that will cause it to do a job, you have to have just the right amino acid at most of these sites so that the forces between them will cause the protein to fold into a particular shape, okay? Now, that raises the question, well, how does the functioning protein get the right arrangement of amino acids so it folds into the right shape so it'll perform a function? Well, that's where the DNA comes in. The DNA has the instructions that cause the amino acids the right amino acids to attach at the right site and line up in the right way to get the fold and the function. Okay? So information producing a functional molecule. All right? That's the awesome thing. But here's the deal. Here's my question. You can see that this is kind of a combinatorial system. There's lots of different combinations of amino acids and lots of different combinations of those A's, C's, G's, and T's on the DNA. So the question is, in the case of, is the mutation selection case, where we're relying on a random search to generate new functional information, is it more like case 1, where the lock is small enough that you've got enough time to search with the 4 dials, or is it more like case 2, where the lock is so long with so many combinations that the number to search is prohibitive? Is it more like the first case or the second case? That's essentially what the scientists at the Wistar Institute were debating back in 1966. Okay? Well, right on its face, you'd want to say it's more like the second case, because these molecules, protein molecules, to get any kind of three-dimensional structure need at least 75 different amino acids. But most proteins are on the order of several hundreds, like the average is about 300 amino acids long. So that would lead you to think, oh, the search is just going to be prohibitive. Except that, unlike the bike lock case, there is more than one arrangement that will fold into a functional protein out of those gabillions of possibilities. So to really answer the question, we need to know the ratio of the functional to the non-functional arrangements. Everyone following? Okay? And this has actually been now established. It wasn't known in 1966, 1967, but in other words, the question is, for every folded protein like this that will do a job, how many gibberish sequences are there that will lie limp and not do anything? And I have a colleague who worked 14 years at Cambridge University to experimentally decide this question. His name is Douglas Axe. He was a Caltech, did his PhD at Caltech, then did 14 years at Cambridge as a postdoctoral researcher. And he asked this crucial question: how common or rare are the functional sequences of amino acids among all the possible combinations of amino acids? And his experimental research, which was based on a thing called site-directed mutagenesis, determined a ratio of 1 over 10 to the 77th power. So, in other words, we're not dealing with a 4-dial lock or a 10-dial lock. We're dealing with a, well, let's see, I had a neat little animation thing there. A 77-dial lock. Is it spinning? Not really. Anyway, you get the idea. Prohibitive, well, wait a minute. I can't say prohibitive yet, can I? Because what else do I need to know? Time. How many opportunities are there to search the space? Well, it turns out there's an answer to that. There have only been 10 to the 40th organisms in the whole history of life on Earth. You would get to shuffle new DNA every time an organism replicates, so there have been 10 to the 40th replication opportunities. So that's 10 to the 40th opportunities to search the space of possibilities to try to come up with a new functional DNA molecule that could build a new functional protein. That's a lot. 10 to the 40 is a lot. But it's tiny compared to 10 to the 77. You remember from math, when you get the exponents, what do you do with you subtract, right? So 10 to the 40 over 10 to the 77 is 1 over 10 to the 37. So what does that say? That says, in essence, that if every replication event in the history of life on Earth, on this planet, from the beginning of time till now, had been devoted to seeking for a new DNA molecule capable of generating a new protein, it would only search 1 10 trillion trillionth of the possibilities. My 10-dial lock example was 3%. This is 1 10 trillion trillionth, which means it's overwhelmingly more likely that such a mechanism will fail to produce new genetic information than it is that it will succeed in the known time of life on Earth. Just to shift the visual image, imagine a great big haystack the size of the state of Arizona looking for a tiny needle hidden somewhere in the Grand Canyon. It's overwhelmingly more likely that such a search will fail, and for that reason, more and more evolutionary biologists, molecular biologists, protein scientists are saying not a plausible mechanism for generating new information. Okay. Now, that is one of 4 major problems with evolutionary theory that we address in the new Theistic Evolution book. I also discuss several of these in the book, my book, Darwin's Doubt. So the question is then, well, what are the evolutionary biologists doing in response to problems like this? And some of these are even deeper. It turns out that the information in DNA is not even all the information you need. You need higher levels of information to build new forms of animal life. This is called the problem of epigenetic information that's needed to build not just proteins, but new body plans and whole new organs and body plans. Well, what's happening in evolutionary theory is that lots of new models, mechanisms, and theories are being proposed. It started back in the 70s with Stephen Jay Gould and the idea of punctuated equilibrium. It continued with theories called self-organization. At the conference last year at the Royal Society in London, a lot of additional models were proposed, but these models are themselves encountering the same problem. They can't explain the origin of the new information. There's a fascinating new model where the scientist says, well, what we're learning is that mutations aren't random. There's some kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity that allows organisms to respond to stressors from their environment. And that's a really cool new insight into how biology works. The only problem is the scientist, James Shapiro from the University of Chicago, doesn't explain where that pre-programmed adaptive capacity comes from. He shows that the mutations aren't random. There's a pre-programming that biases the mutations or the changes, but that biasing is instantiated in other code. Where's that code come from? He doesn't say. So none of these new models are solving this fundamental problem of the origin of information. Even people who were excited about the new conference, the conference in 2016 at the Royal Society, were disappointed at the outcome. Susan Mazur, who was one of the leaders in this Altenburg 16 group, said the conference was characterized by a lack of momentousness. There wasn't a lot of new models, or there weren't new mechanisms proposed that would solve the problem. And so, for me, this gets back to the issue that we started with. So strange to have leading leading people in the Christian academic world urging the church to accept evolutionary theory as the hermeneutic, the interpretive lens through which they understand theology, when evolutionary biology itself is in a state of crisis. And so my question to those folks is, why attempt to reconcile claims about the creative power of evolutionary mechanisms with a biblical understanding of divine creation if the scientific evidence increasingly casts doubt on the creative power of those mechanisms? We now have some time for, well, let's say I got another minute. You may wonder, I just cited Susan Mazur and characterized the results of the conference at the Royal Society and have described the state of affairs in evolutionary biology. I've made an argument about this problem of the origin of information in the book Darwin's Doubt and summarized that in our new book on theistic evolution. You may wonder what leading people on the other side have said about that, because I think it allows you to assess the strength of the argument I'm making. This was a review of my book that occurred in Science, and it was written by a leading evolutionary biologist at the University of California, Berkeley. He said that Meyer's case depends upon the claim that the origin of new animal body plans requires vast amounts of new genetic information. That's correct. That's my argument. In fact, our present understanding of body plan building, morphogenesis, indicates that new phyla, new animal forms, were not made by new genes, but largely emerged through the rewiring of gene regulatory networks of already existing genes. Here's my contention. You don't need a PhD in biology to get a sense of where this debate is going. A gene regulatory network is a network of different genes that are involved in building a whole new organ system. Each gene contains lots of new information. Professor Marshall says Meyer is wrong. You don't need new genetic information. All you need is for the evolutionary process to rewire these networks of genes so that they'll produce new animal forms. But genes contain information. So to explain the origin of information, he simply begs the question as to prior unexplained sources of information. Just as that model I told you about a minute ago does the theory of natural genetic engineering. So this problem of the origin of information is unsolved, and that's one of the reasons it seems very odd to us that we have leading people in the religious world, in the Christian world, saying, hey, other people, you need to get on board and accept Darwinism or you're going to be intellectually out of date. The problem, Darwinism has not solved, nor has its subsequent models solved, this crucial problem of the origin of form and information. Thank you very much.
We're going to give you the opportunity both here and if you're watching by Facebook, you'll be able to ask some questions over the next few minutes, and we'll have a couple more Q&As yet this evening. But if you'll notice, we've put a couple of microphones up in the center of these two middle aisles, and so if you have a question that you would like to ask, just go ahead and go on up to the microphone, and we will recognize you in order and answer your question.
Hello?
Go ahead.
I'm just going to take this off. Sorry, hold on. First, I have a question. Have you ever been involved in any sort of scientific research yourself in a lab?
Yes, but in a different field, in geophysics initially. Okay. I'm a philosopher of biology and a theoretical biologist, so I oversee a research program with many scientists who are doing lab work. My role has typically been to synthesize that and to explain the research and to formulate the arguments that we're making on the basis of it. So my conclusions are based on scientific research, but I'm not a lab scientist myself, at least not in my present manifestation. Yeah.
Okay, so before I go on, I just wanted to mention that for the sake of my credibility, I've been an undergraduate researcher for 2 years now in developmental biology. I'm the only student at the University of Arizona who's fully funded by the National Institutes of Health. And I can say personally that the evidence I've seen working with the animals I do and the tissues that I do, that the evidence for macroevolution is astounding. And my reasoning for that, and I guess I have multiple questions for you, but I'll try to make it simple. My main question is for you, how you would explain the existence of Hox genes. And are you aware of what Hox genes are?
A couple chapters on that in my book, Darwin's Doubt.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So I'm very curious as to what your explanation is for the existence of Hox genes. And then one more thing I would like to argue is that...
how about we take that first, and then I'll let you come back on this next point, okay?
Okay.
All right? So here, and we can have a little conversation here. I had to skip over some points, but developmental biology is really critical to the case we're making against Neo-Darwinism, and also the case that's coming out of evolutionary biology about the limitations of Neo-Darwinian theory and other evolutionary models. There was some important research that was done in the 80s by two scientists who won a Nobel Prize, Nüsslein-Volhard and Wieschaus. And it was precisely on the issue of developmental biology. They studied the hapless fruit fly, which folks in your field like to torture, I think, in order to get secrets of nature. But what they discovered as they were trying to map the fruit fly, they were basically reverse engineering the fruit fly genome. And what they did is they'd knock out genes, and then they'd see, well, what went wrong in the fruit fly's development. You knock out this one and the wing goes wonky, or you knock out this one and the eye doesn't develop properly. So by doing this kind of reverse engineering, they were able to map the fruit fly genome. They also made an incredible discovery, and that is that if the mutations that they induced were expressed early in the development of the organism, that development just shut down, that they did not get the fruit fly to develop properly. Now, this presents a profound problem for evolutionary theory, because the kinds of mutations you would need to develop a whole new form of animal, a new body plan, would need to occur early, because if they occur late in development after cell differentiation has taken place, the cells are only going to affect a cluster of cells in that particular region of the animal. So to get the whole form to change globally or universally, you've got to get the mutations to occur early. But Nüsslein-Volhard and Wieschaus discovered those are the very mutations that are invariably deleterious or lethal. And they called this problem the problem of embryonic lethals. So this now gets to your question about Hox genes. Hox genes are genes that are sort of master regulators that will coordinate a number of different other genetic, the expression of other genes during development. But they don't occur at the very beginning development. They occur much later after the body plan is already laid down. So oftentimes people will cite Hox genes or mutations in Hox genes as a solution to the problem that I was raising earlier. But in fact, the Hox genes don't solve the fundamental problem, which is getting what you need is a beneficial body plan changing mutation to occur. We get body plan changing mutations that are deleterious. We get mutations that occur late in development that don't affect body plans, but we don't get early acting beneficial body plan mutations, and that's what you need for a fundamental innovation to take place. So that's my answer to your question about Hox genes, but also one of the reasons that we would strongly dispute that the field of developmental biology is providing support for evolutionary theory rather than posing an even more severe question than I had time to talk about in my main remarks.
I won't ask my other question, but I will provide one counter argument to what you just said real quick. And I guess my question now is, how would you then explain the existence of these Hox genes in every single species that humans are aware of?
I would explain them by design. I think they're excellent regulators. They're switches. The Hox genes have been likened to a conductor coordinating all the other instruments. So I think that's elegant design to have an informational system that will coordinate the expression of other information.
I am an evolutionary creationist, by the way. So thank you very much.
That's great. We'll keep talking. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Greetings. Thank you for coming to Arizona and all the work you do.
Hey,
at the
I'm from
Discovery
Seattle.
Institute.
I don't need thanks to come to your nice climate. So.
Well, thank you for all the work you do with the Discovery Institute.
Yeah.
My question is, the following. In kind of evolutionary theory, it seems to me that there are several ideas or several pillars. There's this idea of random mutation and natural selection, but then there's also common descent, right? And so let's just say, for the sake of argument, random mutation, natural selection can't do this. It doesn't have the creative power to create new genes or new body plans or any of those things. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't common descent. And if you have a guided, God changes the genes properly and does the miraculous thing of finding the exact right combination at the right moments, you can have common descent, right? Which is, I think, a lot of what theistic evolutionists believe. They think, oh yeah, well, okay, random mutation, natural selection can't do it, but God did it. And that's how you still get, common descent.
Yeah, and this is where we just get into some real, it's the definitional fuzziness of this debate, okay? You're right, a lot of the theistic evolutionists are now backing off from claims about the sufficiency of mutation and selection and merely defending common descent. In the article by Deb Harzma, from which I quote, she starts by claiming that the mutation selection mechanism is God's way of creating, but she provides no evidence for the creative power of that mechanism in her entire article, but does argue for universal common descent. But that's really a different question. So I acknowledge that that is kind of the rhetorical position of many theistic evolutionists. In the book, for reasons I did not have time to explain, we do provide a critique of the theory of universal common descent. I've almost, for a very long time, been skeptical about it. It's not, and I need to stipulate, it's not something that, for example, proponents of intelligent design are specifically contesting. That's not our big thing. Our argument was there agency involved, detectable agency, intelligence, or was it undirected, okay? And one of the things we've been asking our colleagues in the theistic evolution or evolutionary creationist movement is, what do you think? Is this directed or undirected? When they start talking about God doing things, that's a form of intelligent design, but they also say they're opposed to intelligent design. So we've been asking for clarification about what their actual view is on that question of whether the evolutionary mechanism or process is directed or undirected. But as to common descent, there are a lot more scientific reasons to dispute it or to contest it or doubt it, better word, than are commonly reported. And in the new book on theistic evolution, we have a very good section on that. There's an article just on the fossil record that I co-wrote with a distinguished paleontologist from Germany, Günter Beckley. We write about the pattern of abrupt appearance in the fossil record, which is really striking. Because it's striking because it's very contrary to the continuous picture of the tree of life that we get in the textbooks. What you get in the fossil record, especially at the higher taxonomic levels of phylum, class, order, is abrupt appearance of major groups with no discernible connection to ancestral forms in the lower strata. So I think it's an aspect of evolutionary theory about which there ought to be at least more critical thinking and an open-minded skepticism rather than just, kind of arguing that all reasonable people agree. I think there are reasons to doubt common descent as well.
Thank you. Also, if I could follow up.
Yeah,
is there a place that you can direct us to, a resource, where some plausible explanation for why there are certain animals that appear in the fossil record up here and certain ones that appear here, and why there isn't a direct, or maybe there is a direct line?
Yeah, I think I would recommend this chapter in the Theistic Evolution book by Beckley and, unfortunately, Meyer. It's just the beginning for things that Beckley is writing. He's really brilliant. Longtime curator at the Stuttgart Museum of Natural History in Germany. We first learned about him when he emailed me in 2009 and said, would you please contact me, but please not by email, not at the museum, call me at home between the hours of 7 and 9. I did, and learned that his first thing was that he had a problem. He was the public spokesman for the 200-year anniversary celebration for Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the origin of species. He created a museum display where he had scales of justice with the origin of species on one side and books by intelligent design proponents on the other. And it was set up so that the one book by Darwin outweighed them all. And he had a colleague who said, well, you know, you're going to be asked questions about this in the media because you're our spokesman. You better read the books by the ID people. And he said, I did. And now I got a problem. And he started to become persuaded by those books. And he's thinking deeply about the fossil record. There's another fossil record problem. It's called the waiting times problem. Turns out that in population genetics, using population genetics, you can quantify how much evolutionary change should take place in a given amount of time if you know certain parameters like the generation time and the mutation rate and the population size. And the amount of change that's taking place in these abrupt appearance events is far beyond what you would expect given the amount of time available to the evolutionary process. It exceeds the expected way, or the amount of change, the amount of time required to produce the amount of change observed exceeds the calculable waiting times using standard population genetics, which is the mathematical expression of Neo-Darwinism itself. So that's another deep problem with the fossil record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, over here. Sorry for the long answer.
That's fine. I very much enjoyed your talk. I think everybody did. By the way, I don't have any credentials or any grants.
We're mainly disreputable, so don't worry.
I've read something that you wrote that I would enjoy hearing from you about the irreducible complexity, the organelle, I guess, that's in the cell wall of plants that somehow evolved.
Oh, you're talking about probably Michael Behe's work on the bacterial
Right.
flagellar motor. And, yeah, he wrote an extraordinary book, 1996, describing these miniature machines, the nanotechnology that we're discovering in cells, sliding clamps, rotary engines, little turbines, robotic walking motor proteins, the kinesin motor proteins. There are a couple, maybe 2 or 3 dozen classes of these different nanomachines that are being discovered inside cells. They have the property of having multiple components that need to be working in coordination for there to be any function at all. And so Behe has argued that this is another challenge, a deep challenge to the mutation selection mechanism, because natural selection selects for functional advantage. If you have a system of multiple parts that produces no function until you get the entire ensemble of parts working in coordination, then there's nothing to select at many of the intermediate stages on the way from non-function to function. And if there's nothing to select, then there's nothing for natural selection to do, and the evolutionary process terminates at that point. And so he said, you know, these things that give extraordinary appearance of design because of their exquisite machinery involved really are not explained by the designer's substitute mechanism of mutation and selection. And he argues if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it actually is a duck, maybe it actually is designed. The claim has been made that Behe's been refuted by, with respect to this. The flagellar motor is amazing. It's a roughly 30-part nanomachine that has a rotor, a stator, O-rings, a bushing, a drive shaft. Other amazing machines are things like the ATP synthase. I have one of those animated on the website darwinsdoubt.com. But in any case, people have claimed to refute Behe by saying, well, there was a simpler subsystem of the flagellar motor that can exist in isolation of the rest of the motor as a whole. It's got a little 10-part syringe-like thing called a type 3 secretory system. Lots of problems with that. It turns out when you do the genetic analysis on it, the type 3 secretory system appears to be a devolutionary breakdown product of the aboriginal, more complex system, not an evolutionary precursor. And in any case, the 29, 28, 27, 26, 25, 24, 23 part, all those intermediate stages, intermediate steps are not functional. So Behe's argument, I don't think really has been refuted, despite claims to the contrary on the internet. Sorry for that quick answer, and
Thanks.
I think we're done.
We'll take these two more
two
real
more.
quickly.
Okay, then I'm off the stage for JP. Sorry.
Okay. Dr. Meyer, I've been following the Discovery Institute blog for a long time and the podcast, but my question was, when I was reading through Darwin's Doubt, most of what I saw was connected to the animal fossil record. Is there anything comparable in the plant fossil record where we see a emergence of plant phyla suddenly?
Yeah, it was what Darwin called his abominable mystery. It's the sudden emergence of flowering plants in the Cretaceous. It's equally dramatic. It's one of the 17 separate abrupt appearance radiations or events that Dr. Beckley and I describe in the article in the Theistic Evolution book on common descent in the fossil record. So yes, in plants, but also birds, mammals, the first reptiles, turtles. I mean, there's many, many, many different classes of organisms that come abruptly into the record, and it's kind of, Stephen Jay Gould called it the trade secret of paleontology.
I'm seeing a common theme here that people need to buy the book.
It's a behemoth, so I warn you, it makes a nice doorstop too. Yeah, you had a follow-up, and then I should get off here, yeah.
No, I just had the one observation. When I was in college as a younger student, I remember being told over and over again that grasses evolved during the Ice Age or close to it, approximately 40 million years ago, and then it was relatively recently we discovered that dinosaurs have been eating grass all along by studying fossilized dinosaur manure. And okay, all of a sudden they had to change the theory and rewrite everything, but it's like, that's just I remember it being...
Yeah, and some of that's just the understandable revision that takes place in the process of science, but there is a very systematic misrepresentation of the status of evolutionary theory in a lot of textbooks and a lot of popular sources. When you get into the technical stuff, you find, hey, the overwhelming pattern in the fossil record is sudden appearance and stasis. It's not continuity as you first encounter when you see the pictures of the history of life.
I was just scratching my head over, I encountered that, and then all of a sudden these scientists, and I'm a molecular biologist with an MS, but it's like I saw them change their theory all of a sudden and be very willing to rewrite everything, but they are much more resistant to changing the theory in other aspects.
Yeah, and I think some of that is changing. Good point. And maybe I'll take your question separately. I hate to shut you off, but we got JP needing to get up. Yeah. So thank you very much, and for the excellent questions.
We do have a Facebook question that we'll address when the panel comes later on, and